Today I am going to be reviewing this, the Irix 150mm f2.8 macro lens. Now, one thing I do want to emphasize before we start, and it's something that Irix emphasized to me, is this particular lens that I've got for review is still a pre-production lens. So there are one or two small aspects of this particular lens that will differ in the production copy, but I'll address those as we get on. Now, normally I would start this with an unboxing, but as you can see, I don't have a box. So we can just jump straight into the lens itself. So all we'll do is we will start at the bottom and we'll work our way forwards. So at the bottom, we have the lens mount. So mount availability of this lens. It is going to be available in Canon EF, which is the version I have here. It will also be available in Nikon F mount and Pentax K mount. And I know the big question that a few of you have already asked me about now, which is, where is the E mount? Now, this was pretty much the first question that I had for the guys at Irix as well. And I had a pretty lengthy discussion with both their product manager and their CEO about where their standpoint is at the minute. So they are working to try and release E-mount versions of their lenses. However, making a lens is not that straightforward. You obviously have to make it to work with the body properly. And the Sony protocols, getting it to work with their IBIS systems and the likes, is not the easiest thing to just reverse engineer. So Irix are currently in discussions with Sony to try and get basically the licenses to make native E-mount lenses. So it's in the pipeline, they're working on it, but as of yet, there's no word on when we might see that happen. But realistically, with lenses like this, that's not actually a big deal. Generally, the big issue with adapting non-native lenses is autofocus. So you either lose autofocus performance or you lose autofocus features such as the eye autofocus. But you don't have that problem with this lens because, spoiler alert, it's a manual focus lens. So I've been using this lens for the last 3 weeks with my Sigma MC11 adapter on my A7 III body, and I've had no issues with it. It would work exactly the same whether it's an adapted lens or a native E-mount lens. It really makes no difference. So moving forward, lens mount is covered. On the edge of the lens mount, we have a rubber gasket. That is because this lens is weather sealed. And it's not just the one rubber gasket on the back of the lens either. There are multiple gaskets along the breaking points of the barrel. So either end of the focus ring, around the lock switches, up and around the front filter, this entire lens is completely weather sealed. Now moving on up, and moving on out, time to break. So moving up further, you have this indentation all the way around the barrel. That's because this lens should ship with a tripod collar, but unfortunately Irix didn't have one available when I took this lens for me to be able to test it out. But at the end of the day, it's a tripod collar. There's probably not much more to report on it than that, apart from one nice little feature that I can tell you about, which is the collar foot is an Arca Swiss plate. So if you're like me and you have Arca Swiss tripod heads, it means you can just mount the lens straight onto the tripod itself. But if you're using the older conventional tripod heads, there is still a 1/4 inch screw on the bottom of the collar for you to be able to put a quick release plate. Now, while we are still on the barrel itself, this lens differs from Irix's previous lenses. So both their 11 and their 15mm lenses came in two variations, Firefly and Blackstone. Now, this lens differs from that because it's only available in the one version, which is this, called the Dragonfly. So it is a mix between metal and plastic. The back section of the barrel behind the focus ring is all metal, while the front section of the barrel is plastic. Now, I should stress, when I say plastic barrel, I don't mean the whole thing's plastic. The underlying chassis of the lens is still completely metal, so front to back is still metal. So plastic just helps them control the weight. However, just because it's a plastic external, don't think this lens feels cheap, because it really doesn't. It still feels like a well-built premium level lens. Inside the lens, you'll find a very nice 11-bladed aperture system, which I find makes for very nice out of focus backgrounds. Now moving up, we come to the focus ring. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a manual focus lens like their 11 and their 15mm. The focus throw on this lens is insane. It's 270 degrees from minimum to maximum. But don't forget, this is a macro lens, so it's not like you're going to ever really jump straight from minimum focus to maximum focus in one go. Minimum focus is at 34 centimeters. 180-degree rotation of the barrel puts you at about 60 centimeters. So the first 2/3 of the focus ring only actually cover the closest 30 centimeters of focus travel, while the remaining third covers everything else off to infinity. Now, while we're on the topic of focus, I do want to bring up one small point, which is focus breathing. Because this is a 150mm lens. Now, all focal lengths are quoted when the lens is at infinite focus. But as you focus the lens in, the focal length can shift. I know the only other 150mm macro lens that I can think of is the Sigma 150mm f2.8 OS HSM, which is an older lens, but more importantly, that's stated as being 150mm focal length with a 1:1 reproduction ratio. But the Sigma has a minimum focus distance of 38 centimeters, while this has a minimum focus of 34.5 centimeters. Lenses like the Canon 100mm f2.8 have a minimum focus of 30 centimeters, which suggests that at minimum focus, this lens isn't quite a true 150mm. But the focus ring is very smooth to turn, it's very consistent as well, so it doesn't stick anywhere along the way. The whole focus ring is covered in this kind of ridged rubber, so it makes it very easy to grip. And then above the focus ring, we have the focus lock switch. This is another feature that's found on Irix's other lenses as well. So it lets you loosen or tighten the focus ring depending on your personal preference. Now on the 11 and the 15mm, that lock switch pretty much locks the focus ring completely dead. On this particular lens, however, I found that at lock, the focus ring is still pretty easy to turn. It's definitely stiffer than it is at unlock, but you can still turn it quite easily. Now this is one thing that I know Irix are addressing for the production version. So on the production version, the lock end of the switch should make the focus ring a lot stiffer to turn. And then moving forward of the lock switch, we come to the front element where we will find a 77mm front filter. However, I'm not convinced not having 77mm filters is a big problem, because while the front filter might be 77mm, the front element is only actually 67mm. And with it being such a long focal length of 150mm, if you only have 72mm filters, you might be able to get away with just a step down ring to 72mm and using the filters you've already got. And lastly, we have the lens hood. Well, it's a lens hood. The hood itself is quite a flexible plastic, which in itself isn't actually a problem. However, when you mount it on the lens, you get a very solid click that lets you know it's in place, and it is pretty solid once it's on there. Now there's a line on the hood and a line on the body that tell you when the two are lined up and clicked into place properly. Now the hood, when it comes off, rotates this way. Now if you grab the hood so your thumb is on the side of the line where you're rotating to, so like this, the lens hood comes off, not a problem. However, if you put your grip across the line, when you apply pressure to undo the hood, you almost lock the hood into place. It's like the plastic is flexing the hood and locking the bayonet mounts together, so the hood becomes really stiff or pretty much impossible to undo. Like I said, I've notified Irix about this and they've informed me they're going to address it, so hopefully it shouldn't actually be a problem for anybody out there who's buying this lens. But just to let you know, in case, if you do find a situation where the hood is locking into place, just adjust your grip and that's all it is to it. So that's the characteristics of the lens out the way. Let's take a look at some image quality. In terms of image quality, this lens is very, very impressive. Wide open at f2.8, even in the center of the frame, is incredibly sharp. There is a slight drop in sharpness in the corners, but only very minimal. And there is a small amount of vignetting wide open, but again, nothing too noticeable. When you stop down to f4, those corners brighten up quite nicely, and also there is a boost in sharpness. By f5.6, this image is absolutely faultless. Corner to corner is tack sharp and there is no vignetting either. And the image stays pretty much like this even down to f16. Now, close-up image quality wide open is kind of difficult to test because the depth of field is so narrow that you need a completely flat surface. Even this brick wall, there's some areas of the surface that are too close for the depth of field. So sharpness at all focus distance is very impressive, but what about flaring and chromatic aberrations? Well, there basically isn't any. Irix lenses have something called a neutrino coating that is supposed to help suppress ghosting and flaring, and in this lens it does a very, very good job of it. Even shooting directly at the sun going through trees, I just couldn't get any chromatic aberrations to show up on this lens at all. Irix have done an incredible job suppressing color fringing and flaring on this lens. In terms of distortion, as you can see here, this lens is pretty much distortion free. Now, in terms of pricing for all of this, there's no official announcement yet. However, having spoken to Irix, they believe the price is supposed to be somewhere in the region of about 650 euros. So optically fantastic performance and very good build quality as well. I found this lens very comfortable to use. It's very nicely balanced when shooting. Obviously, it is a bit bigger than, say, a 100mm macro, but compared to like a 70 to 200 f2.8, this thing's obviously a lot smaller. So if you're generally shooting around about 150mm focal length, this could be a consideration for you if you're okay with manual focus. So if 650 euros is around the price point that Irix go for, then I would probably describe this lens how I described their 11 and their 15mm, which is that for this sort of performance, you know, a fairly telephoto macro lens, this is probably one of the best price to performance ratio lenses currently on the market. But that's it for this video. What do you guys make of the Irix 150mm f2.8? Has it impressed you? Is it something you were intrigued by? Is it not really your cup of tea? And if so, why? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.